In the past 3 weeks since the balance changes in patch 7.3.1 dropped, I have played this game every day to try out all of the changes. So today I am going to rate all of the DPS classes in terms of damage, survivability and utility to find out which spec is the best right now for Warzones. Starting at the bottom, and this is D tier. D tier is for dog water. So these are specs you can play, but you should expect to struggle. And the only class in D tier right now, it has not changed, is still Concealment Operative. So I saw Kiddo playing it, and in theory you can do good damage, the burst is also nice. So it would be an okay spec if it had 10 meter range. But in the real game, against people who know what they're doing, you will be constantly CC'd and kited. The class has also no AoE, so the only thing it's really good at is hardball and trolling void star doors or pylons for defense or something like that. I would rate Concealment 4 out of 10 for damage, 5 out of 8 for survivability, and utility-wise it doesn't really bring anything to the table for a team fight, so I rate it 1 out of 5. That brings it to a total of 10 points and makes it, in my opinion, currently the worst spec in the game. Now we move on to C tier, and in C tier those are specs that are still below average and in need of some buffs because they do have more weaknesses than strengths, and the only class right now that I see in C tier is Marksmanship Sniper. Now I've played quite a few games of marksmanship recently, and there are actually different builds that I tried and that you can play. And in some games it can do some damage, on the burst can hit quite hard, and actually its AoE is one of the strongest in the game. But overall the reliance on white damage still holds it back, meaning that its DPS is not the best and the burst is also unreliable. Survivability has improved, however, with the introduction of the vital regulators in patch 7.3. So overall, I slightly upgraded marksman score. For damage, I rated 5.5 out of 10. For survivability, I give it 5 points out of 8. And utility-wise, I give it 2 out of 5 for a total score of 12.5 points. Okay, moving on to B tier. B tier, those are specs which I would say are average. So they have some strengths and some weaknesses. Some classes have more, other classes have less. And there are some shuffles in the order that I would rank these classes this time though, after having played most of them. And currently at the bottom of B tier, I see the Vengeance Juggernaut. So Vengeance, while it has the best AoE in the game, you cannot really get it off in the current meta, which is very range heavy. You of course also have no way to really reset a fight, meaning you will be the first target quite a lot, and there is not much you can do about it. I would rate Vengeance 6.5 out of 10 for damage, 4 out of 8 for survivability, and 3 out of 5 for utility, for a total score of 13.5 points. Next we have Hatred. Hatred, of course, also not affected by any balance changes. When it comes to parsing on the dummy, it is still the best single target spec in the game right now. But Hatred DPS is nerfed in PvP by the fact that if you play Hatred, you will spend most of your time rooted and in respawn. That's my way of saying survivability is really the weak point. Overall, I rate Hatred for 8 out of 10 in terms of damage, 4 out of 10 in terms of survivability, and 2 out of 5 for utility. That brings it to a total of 14 points, slightly above Vengeance. Moving on to the Arsenal Mercenary. Now Arsenal has seen some damage buffs in the latest patch, but they didn't really do that much. I've tried it quite a lot and I've seen a lot of other players trying it out as well. Can do 15k DPS, but I did not see a really good DPS game, let's say 16, 17k plus. While its burst can hit quite hard, the reliance on white damage, similar to Marksman, makes it unreliable. Survivability has improved though. Now Arsenal Mercenaries have Thrill of the Hunt baseline, meaning you can always cast Blazing Bolts while moving, and you now always have the opportunity to spec into Kolto Surge. Utility is still good with Electronet. They are 70% slow on Blazing Bolts and Concussion Missile. Overall, I rate Arsenal 4 out of 10 for damage, 7 out of 8 for survivability, and 4 out of 5 for utility, for a total of 15 points. Just above Arsenal in the power ranking right now sits the innovative Ordnance Merc. Now I recently published a guide, so in order to do that I learned to play it myself. Now the damage is better than Arsenal for sure, because you do elemental damage, you have better AoE. Overall it's still not great though. For example, Serrated Shot being the only casted white damage shot in the game feels really weird. For damage, I would rate it 5 out of 10. Survivability is buffed, the same as Arsenal, 7 out of 8. And utility, you do have a slow, it's a bit weaker than the Arsenal one though, so that's 3 out of 5 points there, for a total of 15 points. So same score as Arsenal, but like I said, I prefer damage, which is why I rate IO slightly higher. Next on the list in B tier, we have the Annihilation Marauder. And that one, of course, is a dot spec with mostly 4 meter range attacks. While you can do good DPS in an AoE Zerg, mostly you won't get that, and the other Marauder specs will out DPS it. Survivability, of course, is good, being a Marauder, and the off heal on top of your predation can take some pressure off your healers. So I gave it 6 out of 10 for damage, 6 for survivability, and 3 out of 5 for utility and peels, for a total of also 15 points. Next up, the Deception Assassin. Now, Deception, of course, is famous for its great opening burst, especially if played in combination with something like an engineering sniper. It can be really hard to stop. But since this is not a solo queue arena tier list, it is a tier list that is more focused on Warzones. Deception is only in B tier overall. It gets nerfed quite a lot whenever there is a tank in the Warzone. And also the recent buffs to snipers means that Deception Assassins are having a little bit of a harder time. Deception, of course, has no meaningful way of doing AoE damage, and outside of a super short Shroud and their Vanish, they have no really good defensive cooldowns. The single target and burst is great though, as I already said, so I would rate it 5 out of 10 for damage, 6 out of 8 for survivability, and 4 out of 5 for utility, for a total of also 15 points. Okay, so there's 2 more specs in B tier that also have 15 points, so you could really swap the order around there, which one you prefer. But for me, the next one in the list is the Fury Marauder. Now, Fury can do really good DPS. I have seen 17k recently, for example, but the potential is not as high as Carnage or Rage, for example. However, Fury has great survivability, especially when paired with a healer. However, just like all Marauders, the utility sucks compared to previous expansions. 6 points for damage, 7 points for survivability, and only 2 points for utility give Fury a total of 15 points. Next up, slightly ahead of Fury, I would put the Carnage Marauder. Now, if you have a good game, Carnage is really hard to beat when it comes to DPS. Maybe you've seen the video on my channel recently where Kiddo hit 20k with it, so the potential is there for sure. However, the class really doesn't have no AoE whatsoever, and also it is a white damage class, meaning that tanks with guard really nerf it as well. I would give Carnage 6 out of 10 for damage, 7 out of 8 for survivability, and 2 out of 5 for utility, 15 points as well. Okay, so this is a spec that I played a lot recently and I slightly upgraded it in my tier list as a consequence, and it is the Virulence Sniper. Now, what can I say about Virulence? It is really a good spec without many weaknesses. Single target is good, but not as good as NG. The AoE is good, but it's not as good as Marksman or Lethality. Survivability-wise, it is the tankiest of the sniper specs. It does have a combat reset and 3 rolls, plus now it does have the self-heal due to vital regulators when you uncover, but nothing close to madness. So it really is a quite good spec, jack of all trades, but master of none. The only reason I cannot put the spec higher up is because PowerTechs exist and they counter it quite hard. And also engineering snipers are still to come. Many people are playing them right now and they also are quite a hard matchup. Virulence gets 7 out of 10 for damage, 5.5 for survivability, and 3 for utility, for a total of 15.5 points. Rage Juggernaut is in most games the best single target DPS in the game. It is very consistent. While it doesn't have the best burst, the constant 60, 70 and 80k crits make the spec feel relentless when doing damage. You can solo a healer with it, so the damage is great. And as opposed to Carnage or Deception, it does have some AoE potential. What holds it back is that it struggles defensively versus the ranged and dot classes, because once the Juggernaut uses their defenses, then it's really easy to kill them, and they do have a long cooldown typically. So I would rate Rage Juggernaut 8 out of 10 for damage, 5 out of 8 for survivability, and 3 out of 5 for utility, for a total of 16 points. Coming up next, now we're looking at A tier. And everything in this tier is a spec that's really powerful right now and will perform well in most of your games. And the first two specs I have in A tier are really close when it comes to points. But for me, this time at the bottom of A tier, I have the Lightning Sorcerer. Now, Lightning has been buffed in 7.3.1. And they now have Force Mobility baseline, meaning you can always cast Thundering Blast while moving. On top of that, you can now take Torturous Tactics, which lowers the cooldown on your stun and gives you access to a 25% damage debuff on whoever you're stunning. There are two builds for Lightning. I think both of them deserve a spot in A tier, but when I rated them separately, the result was pretty much the same point-wise. So of course, there's the Halted Offensive, more single-target focus build. I made a quick guide on that, check it out if you want to see it. And of course, this spec had its damage buffed in patch 7.3. However, the single target is still not top tier, but it's better than it used to be. And then of course Lightning can play the Elemental Convection AoE build, for which I already did a detailed guide on my channel, and that one gives you access to one of the best AoEs in the game. But the single target sucks, and you're giving up phase walk, so you have worse survivability. Overall, I think, however, the two builds are relatively close now, so I give Lightning 6 points for damage, 6 points for survivability, and a perfect 5 out of 5 for utility, for a total of 17 points. Next up in A tier, and slightly ahead of Lightning, I see the Engineering Sniper. Now, I played this class quite a lot recently, and the one-shot potential is simply insane. I mean, you can crit almost anyone from half-life and finish them off, which actually makes it a soft counter to the sustained playstyle of Madness or Lethality. However, the sustained DPS and AoE of Engineering are only okay, not great. And you will have energy issues if you're not careful and spamming too much. Damage-wise, however, the burst is absolutely nuts. Survivability has been buffed with Vital Regulators in patch 7.3. That helps a lot against the dot classes, but unfortunately you still struggle versus PowerTechs. Utility is also good. Plasma Probe makes it so melees who are not PowerTechs can't really play the game, especially if there's more than one engineer on the enemy team. And I think if they buff the spec any further than this, it will break the game and make Warzones unplayable. And I mean that both in terms of gameplay and frame rate. With a total of 17.5 points, I rank Engineering Sniper as the currently second best spec in A tier. At the top of A tier, we have my main spec, and that's of course the advanced prototype PowerTech. Now, the removal of Neural Trigger definitely hurt it a lot, and as I expected, the new tactical sucks. But AP is still in a good place in terms of the meta. It counters snipers, which are plenty recently, and it is one of the few classes that have enough burst to kill the top classes, which are still to come, one-on-one with their OP burst. But there are reasons why I cannot put AP in S tier right now. And one of those reasons is that AP, of course, is a cooldown dependent class, and the best classes in the game have even more powerful cooldowns that can deal with the AP PT burst. The AP AoE is good, but it requires enemies to be clumped together. It does not really have the option to multi-dot and apply significant pressure that way. If you want to be an asshole, you can spec into Terminator Droid, which makes all other melees useless. Ironically, the only melee that is not countered by Terminator Droid is another PowerTech because of their 10 to 50 meters range. Weak points are, of course, the lack of a real combat reset. It's go in, do damage, die, respawn, and do it all over again. But the damage and the utility with Carbonize, Pull, and the taunts are so strong that if you use them properly, you will be a force to be reckoned with in any warzone. AP gets an 8 out of 10 for damage, 5.5 points for survivability, and a perfect 5 for utility. With a total of 18.5 points, that puts it right at the top of A tier. Finally, we get to S tier. Now, these are the meta classes, so play this if you want to win more games. And at the bottom of S tier this time, I have the Lethality Operative. So, Lethality is still good, but a slight downgrade after the nerfs. I tried it a few games, and I also noticed that you see way less lethality than you used to see. And that is probably because the single target feels really underwhelming now, that Lethal Strike does not double proc anymore with viral elements. However, the AoE is still really good, has the best dot spread in the game. Survivability has also been nerfed already in patch 7.3 because corrosive return no longer extends the duration of your stim boost by 5 seconds. But overall survivability is still overpowered. 7 seconds of evasion on a very low cooldown, and then the double stim boost with damage reduction that also heals on top of your stealth is really strong. Utility wise, it has very strong off heals. So I rate it 7.5 out of 10 for damage, which is a slight downgrade from my last tier list. 8 points for survivability, and I give it 4 for utility. So with a total of 19.5 points, lethality still is barely in S tier. With a total of 20.5 points and slightly above lethality, I rank Pyro PT as the second best class for Warzones right now. Now it is no secret that I am PowerTech Enjoyer, and you could argue this one either way, but the fact remains that Pyro is an absolute powerhouse. Single target damage is strong, multi-target is also good. Maybe not as good as lethality, but it's up there for sure. And it even has one of the best burst phases in the game with the 15 seconds of auto crits. As opposed to AP, Pyro does not care about tanks because it mostly does elemental damage. Compared to my last tier list, I now rate Pyro 7 out of 8 for survivability. It's clearly tankier than AP, and that is true both versus burst classes because of the 30% damage reduction on Kolto, but Pyro is also tankier because it has a 30% dot damage reduction passively, and that's very strong in a meta where the 3 most powerful classes are all dot specs. Of course, Pyro also has some of the strongest utilities in the game, the only downside being that Terminator Droid and Shield Retribution are on the same tier. That being said, I rate Pyro 8.5 points out of 10 for damage, 7 out of 8 for survivability, and 5 out of 5 for utility, for a total of 20.5 points. And last but not least, Madness Sorcerer. The king is dead, long live the king. When I read the patch notes, I thought first they had nerfed Madness, and I made a whole other video where I go over the patch notes and explain why I think that the Madness changes were actually buffs for PvP at least. And that is still true after having played it now. The only thing where Madness got nerfed is if you get bursted by multiple people or by a ranged opponent where you cannot use your new 25% DR hard stun from Torturous Tactics. So yes, engineering or AP or even deception can blow it up now. But even then, you still have phase walk, you still have your 15% permanent DR from your dots. You get 5k HPS passively in your damage rotation, which is insane. The single target is very strong with Tempest of Row, but you can also tap dot and watch everyone tick down slowly. Or you play Killing Field, which gives you one of the strongest cleaves in the game overall. It is a better version of Lightning in most scenarios and also easier to play. With the changes in patch 7.3.1, you can now choose Plague Master for one of the strongest bursts in the game as well. Or you choose Critical Movement, which lowers the cooldown of your force speed to 9 seconds. And in combination with Force Mobility now being baseline, this makes you the most mobile spec in PvP. 8 points for damage, 8 points for survivability, and a perfect 5 for utility means that with a total of 21 out of 23 possible points, Madness is the best spec for Warzones right now. So there you have it, guys. Some upgrades, some downgrades. That being said, this is of course only my own experience from playing on 3 servers and mostly in premates with other premates. So if you're playing solo queue arenas on Satil Shan, then your experience might be quite different from mine. That being said, I am working on an arena tier list, so stay tuned for that if you want to see that. And by the way, guys, for the new guys, in case you're wondering why I didn't rank any Republic classes, please Google Mirror class, because Madness, for example, is the same as a Balance Sage. So just Google it and check that out. So as always, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.